Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
I covered every family celebration for years, not because anyone asked nicely or promised to rotate or even said thank you in a way that felt like they meant it, but because the first time I did it I was proud of myself and it felt generous and adult and uncomplicated, and then the second time I did it someone joked that I had a good job and could handle it. And then the third time nobody even looked around the table before the check appeared because the habit had hardened into a rule that apparently I wrote without knowing it. So by the time Easter rolled around and I heard my aunt laugh to my cousin that we had our own cash machine, I had already learned how a smile can sound like a slap when you realize it is not affection, it is entitlement. And I sat there pretending I did not hear it because I wanted to see, with clean eyes and no excuses, how far they would go when they believed I would go further. If you asked me when it started, I would say it began with a dinner after a cousin's graduation where I said I've got this, since I felt happy and flush, and I liked being the one who could smooth things out when the server looked at us like we were a complicated family with too many separate checks. And then it spread to birthdays and Mother's Day and barbecues, and those last-minute takeout nights where someone said, let's just order, and she will handle it because she always does, and while I told myself I did not mind, I also began to notice how people who once carried wallets now carried opinions about appetizers, and how the relatives who talked about being careful with money were strangely carefree the moment a menu touched their hands. And how the little theatrics of gratitude evaporated as soon as dessert forks arrived, because apparently kindness is bottomless if it is someone else's bottom. I am not pretending I was a saint about it, because I liked the little status bump it gave me and the quiet power of signing a slip without blinking. And I liked being the responsible one after years of being cast as the odd one out who did not marry fast or pop out a baby on a schedule. So paying felt like proof that I was not a disappointment even if I did not live the script they preferred. Yet there is a thin line between generosity and buying your way out of family judgment, and I kept crossing it, then calling it love, which is a tidy trick right up until someone says the quiet part and you hear your role described not as daughter or cousin or sister, but as a device with buttons. The memories pile up in a way that makes me cringe now, like the night that was supposed to be for my birthday when my mother said sweetly that I loved doing this and the server placed the bill in front of me with practiced accuracy. Or the Christmas Eve where I covered everyone and then still got teased for not bringing extra bottles because apparently paying did not count as contributing. Or the Sunday brunch when my sister announced she was saving for a vacation and winked at me because saving is easier when your eggs are always free, and I know there were moments when I could have spoken up, but every time I tried to clear my throat the table shifted and the topic changed and someone raised a glass and called me generous, as if a toast were payment. So when I walked into Easter dinner, I had a calm I did not expect, the kind that comes after you rehearse a boundary so many times in your head that it becomes muscle memory. And I took my seat and listened to the small talk and waded through the appetizers while my aunt performed her usual routine about budgeting and being practical, and then leaned toward my cousin with that laugh I used to think was charming and said that with our own cash machine here we could relax, and I felt the old urge to laugh along just to make the moment pass, but I swallowed it because this time I wanted to be awake for what came next, and I wanted to notice who would look at me when the bill landed and who would look away. I kept thinking about how no one ever asked what it cost me beyond the money, like the small resentment that creeps into your chest when someone orders the priciest thing because they are not the one counting. Or the way a family can train you to be useful so thoroughly that you forget to be a person, and I thought about how loyalty points and rewards programs became my private joke, because points feel like candy for a kid you keep quiet with sweets, and how the only person who ever tried to push a card toward the check was my uncle on the night he knew I had just paid for a repair that wiped out my savings, and even then he hesitated, waiting for me to say no, and I did say no because the reflex was stronger than my bank balance. If you think I was angry, you are right, but it was not the hot kind that makes you slam doors. It was the steady, focused kind that makes you plan. So earlier that week I moved my usual dining card out of my wallet and tucked it in a drawer. And I left the handy excuses at home with it, and I told myself that if I felt the old pull to rescue the table I would have to work for it, because I wanted it to be easier to tell the truth than to reach for plastic, and I was not trying to humiliate anyone, I was trying to stop humiliating myself. The server kept coming and going, the way they do when they can sense a table believes it is important, and I watched how relaxed everyone was when it is easy to be generous with someone else's pocket. And I thought about all the meetings I had sat through at work where men who called themselves mentors explained that boundaries were leadership and that clear expectations were kindness. And I wondered why I could do that in a conference room, but not at a table with my own last name. And then the server brought the check and set it down in that confident way that said they knew which direction the wind always blew in this family. Everyone looked at me, of course they did, and I let the silence stretch a little longer than usual because I wanted to feel what it felt like when no one jumped in with the automatic line about me being amazing. And I saw my sister shift in her chair and my mother touch her necklace and my aunt measure the distance between the bill and my hand as if it were just a matter of time, and I thought about that laugh from earlier and how it landed in my chest like a dare. And I knew I was not going to blink first. I stood up, calm in a way that felt like a promise to myself, and I pushed my chair in and looked at the table the way you look at a habit you are about to break, and I said that the cash machine was closed. And for a second no one understood, because they were still inside the old story where I pay and they praise, and then the words landed and the room went quiet in a way you can hear even in a crowded place. And before anyone could recover with the usual mix of jokes and guilt, I smiled the way you do when you have already decided, and I said I would let them figure it out, because I was done, and if anyone wanted to talk to me about selfishness later, they could start by bringing their receipts from the last few years. The moment after I said the cash machine was closed felt like one of those strangely slow minutes where everyone is still waiting for the old script to pick itself up and start speaking again, because habit is a loud thing and embarrassment is even louder. And while the silence stretched across the table in a way that made people fidget with napkins and avoid eye contact with the little black folder sitting between the water glasses, I could feel that familiar pull to rescue everyone surge through me like a reflex I had trained too well, and I decided, with the kind of steadiness you get only after many stubborn nights of talking to yourself like a coach, that I would not move first. Not this time. Not after the laugh I heard earlier, and not after the years when my name quietly replaced the word family on every bill. It is funny how a pattern that starts as a warm gesture can turn into a job title you never applied for, because when I look back at the dinners that trained us into this mess, I remember the graduation where I paid because I wanted to do something generous and uncomplicated, and then the Mother's Day where the server slid the check straight to me because someone told him I would take care of it. And after that, the birthdays and the barbecues and the casual Sundays folded into a routine where people who called themselves careful with money somehow became very brave with appetizers and cocktails the second a menu touched their hands, and while I pretended I was fine with it because I liked being the dependable one who could sign and smile, the truth is that the applause I got for being generous was really approval for being convenient, and approval for being convenient has a way of making you disappear. I do not think anyone sat down and made a plan to use me, and maybe that is what made it worse, because when no one names the thing out loud you start believing the problem is your attitude and not the math. And I kept telling myself that I should be grateful I could afford it, even when I was juggling my own bills and watching my savings slide because some cousin wanted an extra round, and I told myself it would all even out somehow down the road, which was a pleasant fairy tale given that no one ever reached for the folder unless a server accidentally set it closer to them, and even then the move was more of a theatrical pat for a wallet than an actual attempt to pay, and I know this, because I was right there with a fast smile and a quick card, making sure no one had to feel awkward except me. So there we were at Easter, and I could see the shape of the old dance everyone wanted to do, with a little gasp and the soft praise and the routine where my aunt joked about budgeting while ordering the most expensive entree and a dessert she would only take 2 bites of before pushing her plate away. And I could feel the irritation in my chest that I used to call generosity just to make it sound noble, and I let that feeling do its job, which was to keep my spine straight while I took a breath and decided that if we were going to behave like adults, then adults could pay for what they enjoyed. And I would help the process by removing the fog of confusion that always settles when a bill lands among people who have trained themselves not to look directly at it. I caught the server's eye and asked, clearly and politely because this was not a fight and I would not make it one, to split the bill by person and to put each item on the check of the person who ordered it. And when the server hesitated in that way people do when they know a table has a complicated hierarchy, I smiled and said I could help, and I pulled out the notes I had been making quietly through the meal because I understand my family better than they think. And I walked the server through the list with the kind of calm that leaves very little room for negotiation, explaining that the roasted entree with the premium add-on and the 2 specialty cocktails belonged to my aunt, that the extra dessert sampler belonged to my sister who insisted she would share and then did not, that the kids' meal that became an adult entree after a few bites belonged to my cousin, and that my own plate and single drink were mine and mine alone, which felt like a sentence I had been waiting years to say. The reaction traveled around the table like a slow wave of people remembering they had wallets, and while my mother murmured the word holiday as if that were a coupon that changed the arithmetic, and my sister tossed out the word selfish with the confidence of someone who has never paid for a table in her life, and my aunt tried to make it cute by saying we did not need to get technical, I kept my voice level and said that getting technical was the only fair way to do this, that the way we had been doing it was not kindness, it was laziness dressed as tradition, and that if anyone wanted to be generous tonight they could do it on their own check without nominating me as the sponsor of their appetite, and, because I have learned to close loops at work, I closed this one by asking the server to add a fair tip of 18% to each separate check so that no one could punish the staff for our discomfort. I will not lie and say I did not enjoy the way the color changed on my aunt's face when the server read her total in a voice just loud enough to be heard by the people who had been giggling earlier, and I will not pretend it did not satisfy some quiet, bruised place in me to watch my sister scroll her payment app with a frown like the numbers were personally insulting her, and while a part of me wondered if I was going too far, a louder part knew that the only thing excessive here was the years where I paid to keep the peace and learned that peace built on one person surrendering is not peace at all, it is training, and I had trained them too well, which meant I had to retrain them. The checks went out like little verdicts, and the room rediscovered the sound of adults discussing money with the server like adults, not like children waiting for allowance. And when my aunt patted her bag and made the predictable claim that she had left her card at home because she never needs it at family dinners, I smiled in a way that let her know I had anticipated the line and said that was all right because the restaurant accepted phone payments, and I would happily wait while she figured it out, and I watched her realize that there would be no hidden rescue tonight, not from me, not from anyone else who suddenly remembered that fairness is uncomfortable when you have been comfortable for too long. And while the table scrambled and the manager drifted nearby and the server held their ground like a professional, I felt the calm click into place again because this was only step 1. And I had something else ready for tomorrow that would make sure no one forgot how this felt. By the time I got home that night the group chat was already performing its usual little play where outrage pretends to be concern and concern is really just a demand dressed up as manners. With my mother typing that holidays are about grace and my sister writing that I had humiliated the family for sport like some bored heiress experimenting with boundaries, and my aunt dropping a line about how the economy is tough for everyone in a tone that suggested I should apologize for not subsidizing her appetite, and while I watched the dots appear and vanish like a chorus warming up, I felt the old tug to explain myself soften into something steadier and not at all apologetic. Because I had promised myself that the next morning would not be a day for debate, it would be a day for documentation and decisions, which is to say I would finally give my family what they avoid most. A list with numbers and names and dates that ties cause to effect and leaves very little room for magical thinking. So I slept, not perfectly but better than I had expected, and when the sun came up I did what I do at work when I inherit a messy project that everyone has feelings about and no one has facts for. I opened my banking app and my email and the little folder of photographed receipts I had started keeping the night I realized that my own birthday dinner had been staged as a performance of gratitude that ended with the bill in my lap. And I built a simple ledger that did not shout or accuse, it just lined up the meals and the who and the what and the totals, and I watched the pattern emerge like a bruise you finally admit is not going away, because the page did not care about family myths or soft focus stories, it showed, in unflattering clarity, that I had been the default payer for almost every holiday and celebration for years, while the most vocal critics of my decision at Easter were also the boldest orderers and the lightest tippers, and that our tradition was not generosity, it was outsourcing, with me cast as the contractor who was never issued a contract. I wrote a message to the family that took me longer than I wanted because I refused to sound angry even though I had every right, and I told them, in sentences that were calm and complete and left no hinge for argument to swing on, that I was not asking anyone to reimburse the past because I do not want their money in arrears and because collecting back pay for love is a punishment I do not intend to impose. But I was effective immediately, changing the way we do business as a family. And I use that word on purpose because if we are going to treat meals like transactions, then we should honor the terms, and the terms are simple. Each person pays for what they consume. Deposits for private rooms go on the host's card. Tips are not negotiable. And the waiter is not a prop in our discomfort, which means we will specify the gratuity up front like adults who do not outsource their decency. Then I attached the ledger as a clean document with totals and dates and a small note at the top that said this is not a bill, this is the truth, and I hit send to the group and to the subset that tends to pretend they miss things. And before I could regret the clarity, I opened my email to the restaurant that was holding a private space for my father's upcoming birthday because months ago, in a moment of optimism and habit, I had put the deposit on my card to get the reservation secured, and I wrote to the manager with the kind of politeness that gets things done and asked him to remove my card from the file and hold the room for the next 24 hours while the actual host provided a payment method. And I told him I would not be covering the event and that any menu decisions or costs should be discussed directly with the family contact, whom I named. Because the only thing worse than enabling a pattern is leaving a stranger to absorb the blowback when you stop enabling it. Predictably, the group chat lit up again, not with gratitude for the clarity or even curiosity about the totals, but with the same tired ideas about how I am being dramatic and how families do not keep score, and I answered once, just once, that this is not a scorecard, this is accountability, and that the reservation for my father's party will be released at noon tomorrow if a card is not placed on file by the person who wanted the private room and the fixed menu, and then I put my phone down. Because I know what happens next, the scrambling and the whispered calls and the tiny alliances that bloom when people are faced with the bill they thought was imaginary, and I decided I would not carry that noise around the house today. I would let the choices do the talking while the clock does its honest counting. Within the hour, my aunt called me directly, bypassing the chat so she could perform intimacy and negotiate a discount in the same breath. And she launched into a careful speech about how this was not how our family works and how she would of course help with part of the deposit once she got paid next month, and how I should just keep my card on file for now because it would be simpler. And I told her that simpler for her had been expensive for me and that we were done with simple and returning to fair, and when she tried the line about my father deserving a beautiful night, I said he does, and that is why the person planning it should shoulder the planning, which includes actual payment. And before she could turn that into a character assassination of my boundaries, I wished her a good day and hung up, then texted the manager to confirm that the deadline stood. By evening, the story had traveled through all the side channels that families pretend do not exist, and people I love, but do not trust with my wallet, were sending me private messages asking if I was sure I wanted to do this right before my father's celebration. And I said yes, because kindness without boundaries is just a subsidy with a smile, and when I went to bed, I put my phone on Do Not Disturb and slept with the relief that shows up when the truth is finally carrying its own weight, and in the morning I made coffee and opened my laptop and saw the manager's email sitting there, polite and neutral, letting me know that as of that moment no card had been added and the room would be released at noon. And while the group chat pulsed with dots and apologies and sudden declarations of poverty from people who have never once declined an appetizer, I looked at the time and let the minutes tick, not because I wanted the party to fall apart, but because I wanted the people who love the party most to finally meet the bill, and as the clock marched toward noon, my phone lit up with my sister's name, and I let it ring, because sometimes the cleanest revenge is to let other people feel the cost of what they have always assumed is free. And with 10 minutes left, the manager called me to confirm one last time, and I took a breath and said, "Do what you need to do," and then I waited to see who would actually pay. When noon came and went without a new payment on file, I felt the kind of quiet you get when a long argument finally ends, because there is nothing left to say. And while the group chat threw sparks about timing and tone and how I could have handled it privately, the restaurant manager sent a short, polite note confirming that the private room for my father's celebration had been released and the waitlist had already claimed it, which meant the fantasy that I would cave at the last moment and slide my card back into the machine died a clean, administrative death, and in that instant I understood that all the noise about tradition and grace had really been background sound for a single assumption, that I would always blink first, and since I did not, the room vanished, the bill migrated from my pocket to the middle of the family, and the scramble began in earnest. My aunt called again with a voice that tried for warm concern and landed on managerial scolding, insisting that I had embarrassed everyone and sabotaged a milestone. And I told her calmly that nothing had stopped her from placing her own card the moment I removed mine, that the deadline was clear and the instructions were simple, and that the only thing I had removed from the process was the subsidy. After which she pivoted to the old guilt script about how my father deserved a beautiful evening, and I said he does, which is why I was done gambling his celebration on the assumption that I would fund other people's appetites, and before she could spin that line into a character flaw, I told her I had already moved the party, that the new plan matched my father's taste and my boundaries, and that anyone who wanted a seat could claim it by paying for it themselves, which is not cruelty, it is adulthood. The move took less than an hour because I stopped thinking like the family treasurer and acted like a project manager who has learned to design away failure points. So I called a smaller place my father actually likes where the owner answers the phone himself, and the policy is simple and merciless in the best way. No holds without payment and every seat secured by a small, non-refundable per-person deposit credited to that person's own check, and I set up a fixed menu that keeps choices reasonable. Specified the gratuity up front so no one could punish the staff when they ran out of generosity, gave the restaurant a list of names for individual payment links, and asked them to send a separate check to each confirmed guest at the end of the night without announcing totals out loud, because I did not need a new performance of public shame. I needed a smooth process that made hiding impossible. I sent the invitations one by one instead of dumping them into the group chat because I wanted to remove the thrill of collective outrage and replace it with solitary decisions, and the note was short and neutral and contained 4 lines. The new date and time chosen around my father's work schedule, the link for a single seat deposit attached to each person's name, the statement that deposits would lock the seat and would be credited to that person's bill, and the reminder that no one is paying for anyone else, not me, not my father, not the restaurant, not the future, and because I knew someone would try to forward the link to a +1 and then arrive with an extra mouth and a lecture about family spirit, I had the owner tie each link to the name on the invitation, which meant the only way to bring a guest was to ask me directly, and the only way to ask me directly was to admit you wanted something and to hear me say the price out loud. Within minutes, the pattern emerged again, which was useful because clarity is a gift even when it stings, and the first payment came from the cousin who has never made a scene about money because he has a quiet pride in paying for himself, followed by my father's old friend who replied with a simple "see you there" that felt like a hand on my shoulder, and then came the predictable flurry of messages from the people who had made the loudest noise at Easter, asking if I could hold a spot while they sorted out their budget, or if I could float the deposit until payday, or if I could make an exception for a spouse, because it would mean so much not to have to explain this new policy to someone who was not raised in our family, and I answered once to each, kindly and without apology, that there are no holds and no exceptions, and that explaining a boundary is a good skill to learn before dessert. Somewhere between those messages my mother called, not to negotiate but to ask in a small voice whether I had told my father what I was doing and whether he would be hurt by the move to a smaller place. And I said I had asked him nothing yet because this celebration was supposed to be a gift, not an obligation, and that I intended to tell him in person after work, and she sighed and said she missed when things were simple, and I said things were never simple. They were just paid for, and she was quiet in a way that told me she was scrolling the new links and calculating who would actually show up when attendance cost more than a compliment. By late afternoon, the owner texted to say that more than half the seats were confirmed and that the remaining links were idle, and at nearly the same moment the original restaurant called to tell me, with the gentle delight of someone who sees irony for a living, that my aunt had tried to rebook the released room by invoking the usual arrangement and was surprised to learn that there was now a policy requiring full payment up front for large family parties because of a recent issue in which a host abandoned the bill at the last minute, and when he said recent I knew they meant us, and I did not argue. I only thanked him for the update and the professionalism and hung up as messages started piling in from people who had assumed they could outrun the clock and had discovered the clock was finally faster than their intentions. I drove to see my father because some conversations should not be conducted through screens, and I told him, simply and without the family fog, that I was done paying for everyone and that I had moved his dinner to a place he actually likes with a plan that lets everyone show up as adults. And he watched me with the patient look he uses when something important is being said and asked me if I was doing this to punish people or to protect myself, and I said both in the way that any boundary protects by forcing other people to face themselves, and he nodded and said he was proud, and then he asked a question that pulled the air right out of the kitchen. He asked whether I wanted him to invite my aunt and my sister himself to make it clear that the only way in was to pay, and before I could answer his phone buzzed with my sister's name, lighting the screen like a siren, and he looked at me, then at the phone, and said should I pick up, and I said that depends on whether you want your celebration to start now or later, and he smiled in a tired way and pressed accept. My father answered my sister's call on speaker because he has learned, the hard way and with a patience I do not always deserve, that sunshine kills mold faster than bleach. So when she launched into the familiar blend of outrage and soft pleading about how I was ruining an important night and how a family should not need links and deposits to eat together, he listened without interrupting, then told her with a steadiness that made me want to sit down that he would love to see her and that the invitation was clear and that there was a seat waiting if she wanted to claim it the same way everyone else had, in her own name and with her own card. After which she tried to pull him into the old triangle by asking if he could take care of it and she would settle up later, and he said, with a warmth that did not blink, that later had been arriving for years and that he was choosing today instead. When the night finally came, it did not feel like a war or even a showdown. It felt like those rare mornings when a room you have ignored for too long is finally cleaned, because the smaller restaurant was humming without performing. The owner nodded at my father the way people nod when they are glad to see the person and not the credit limit, and the table had names on place cards that matched the deposits exactly, which meant there were no phantom chairs to be claimed by late arrivals with big appetites and small boundaries, and while a few familiar faces were missing and a few familiar voices were loudly missing, the people who did show up did it with an ease I did not expect, paying their own way the same way they choose their own habits. No ceremony required. My aunt arrived with her husband and a niece who had not been invited because she is not my father's friend, and this is not a festival. And she floated the idea that the extra chair could be squeezed in and that I would not mind covering the deposit because family is about flexibility, and the owner, who has seen more holiday dramas than all the streaming services combined, smiled gently, pointed to the list, and said that he could seat the niece at the bar with her own tab if she wished, that she was welcome as a paying guest, and that he could not convert a refusal to plan into a surprise extension for free, after which my aunt spent a few minutes testing the weak points in the policy like a tired locksmith before realizing there were none. And she sent the niece home with a huff that sounded like a tire losing air. I had asked the owner for one quiet tweak that bordered on petty in the way a well-balanced scale can look petty to someone who has enjoyed a lifelong discount, which was that each place card would also carry a tiny printed summary of the diner's own orders as the evening progressed, not to shame anyone and not to limit anyone, but to keep the math visible and to make sure that if someone ordered extra plates for the table under the old assumption that the table had a sponsor, the sponsor would be their own card, and it was fascinating to watch how quickly people who preach moderation to other people practice it themselves the second total meets plate in real time. My father, who hates speeches almost as much as he hates being told he should be grateful for things he did not ask for, lifted his glass and said one of those short, perfect things he says when he is forcing himself to be social. Namely that he wanted a meal where the food tasted like the food and the company felt like company and the money belonged to the mouth that enjoyed it, and that he was grateful to spend an evening with adults, and there was an awkward second where everyone laughed a little too loudly because any sentence with the word adult is a mirror, and then people started eating, and the room relaxed into something that felt suspiciously like respect. For my gift, I did not bring a watch or a gadget or a promise to do better. I brought the absurd pile of restaurant rewards and loyalty points I had converted over the past week into a simple, boring card that could be used by one person only, my father. At the handful of places he actually likes rather than the trendy spots my sister drags us to when she wants photographs of plates, and when I handed it to him in a plain envelope and told him that this was not a repayment for the past, but a redirect of the future, that every time he wanted a quiet dinner he could have one without negotiating with the family budget committee, he looked at me in a way I will keep in my pocket for a very long time. And he said a thank you that landed like a blessing because it had nothing to do with debt. The finale I had designed was not explosive or cruel because I am done with fireworks that leave me holding a hose. It was administrative, which is how most real power looks when it is done properly. So earlier that day I had dropped sealed envelopes at the houses of the people who had raged the loudest, each one containing the ledger I had built with a cover page that said this is not a bill. This is the cost of habits, along with a note that explained, in the same neutral tone I use at work, when I am closing a messy project, that going forward I would attend family meals under one rule only, separate checks by default, no pooled bills, no last-minute theatrics, and that anyone who wanted to host was welcome to do so under the obvious terms of hosting, which involve paying for what you invite. Because I know how families work when there is no clear policy, I took one final step that still makes me smile when I think about it, which was to go through the list of places we frequent and add a note to my profile where possible that my card is not to be accepted for group charges without my physical presence and verbal consent at the moment of payment. A small line that will not change the world, but will change my world when a server looks around for the obvious payer and decides to ask the question instead of assuming the answer, and if you think that is extreme, then you have not lived inside a story where convenience masquerades as affection. By dessert, the room felt lighter in the way rooms feel when a hidden tax has been lifted, and while a few people excused themselves early with the stunned politeness of shoppers discovering that an item is not on sale after all, the ones who remained leaned into conversation that did not orbit price or envy or blame, and when the checks arrived as quietly as the bread had, each with the automatic tip we had set at the beginning, there was no theater. There was only the soft music of cards and pens and the private arithmetic of grown people paying for their own choices. My sister texted after midnight to say that I had made my point and that I could stand down now, and I wrote back, without heat and without apology, that I had not made a point, I had corrected a policy, and that the correction would stand whether she attended or not, after which she sent the tiny volley of accusations families keep in a drawer for emergencies, and I did the most scandalous thing a former cash machine can do. I did not answer, because silence, when it protects your dignity, is not passive aggression, it is maintenance. I wish I could tell you that the next holiday was perfect and that everyone learned the lesson and no one tried anything clever, but what actually happened was better, which is that the people who wanted to eat together did so with their own wallets and their own pride. And the ones who wanted the old discounts stayed home to lecture their mirrors, and in the end, when I think about the first time I heard my aunt laugh about having our own machine and how I waited and waited for someone to flinch at the truth, I only remember the look on my father's face when he realized the night would be about joy and not tribute, and I remember the silence that fell when the owner set down the checks with everyone's name printed at the top. A silence that did not shame me into paying, a silence that felt like a door closing behind me with a lock I finally owned. And if you need a last line to wrap it in a bow, then take this and pass it around. The machine is closed, the people are open, and I am Done paying for anyone's appetite but my own.